Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am from Warren, Ohio, whether you're in North Alabama, Key West, Florida, or up in Seattle, Washington, or anywhere in between. I'm all throughout the East, many places throughout the West, and I drive people to work or I get them up in the morning. I'm from Warren, Ohio. That is the heart of the Western Reserve. It is, I am Buckeye through and through. My youngest son's middle name is Ohio. I have been talking Buckeye sports forever, so get used to a little Cleveland Guardians, Cleveland Browns, Cleveland Cavaliers, and the Ohio State University Buckeye talk throughout the year, no matter where you're from, just a little bit here and there. Coach Urban, if you're listening, good morning to you. Good buddy of the show, Coach Urban Meyer. Now, I have been in broadcast since 1990 when I started for KFI AM 640 in LA. But before that, I had a life. I was in Warren, Ohio, K through 12, Catholic schools. I am a evangelical Roman Catholic Presbyterian. That means I went to Mass on Sunday morning, and I go to Mass every week, and I often go to the Presbyterian Church, and I've served as an elder, and that's just fine. I leave the theology to other people. I like them both, but I am an RC, Cradle Catholic. And after John F. Kennedy High School in Warren, Ohio, and Blessed Sacrament Elementary School, I went off to Harvard because they had an Ohio quota back then. And I got in, and I did well. And after Harvard, I didn't get into Harvard Law School, and I didn't get into Michigan Law School, and I was stubborn. I didn't want to go to the University of Chicago. I didn't want to go to Virginia Law. I didn't know anything. I was stupid and young. But I got an offer to go to work for David Eisenhower in San Clemente, California, as a research assistant to do what is known as a tick-tock of Ike during the war, which was, you need to know where Eisenhower was every day, and sometimes, if he moved during the day, where he moved to. So that was my first job out of college, was researching Ike. After 4 months, I was offered and accepted a job from former President Richard Nixon at the Elba of America, the old Western White House in San Clemente, and I went to work with the former president and a guy named Ray Price, who was his senior writer, and Ray and I replaced Frank Gannon, Ken Kachigian, and Diane Sawyer as the writing team on site for his second book. He first wrote RN, his memoir in exile after he resigned the presidency 50 years ago this August. And he went to San Clemente and he got through phlebitis and he recovered. He wrote RN, did the Frost interviews. Then he wanted to write a book on national security policy, and I happened to have been the editorial assistant for that, junior to Ray, working every day with the former president, Ray Price. That was my graduate school. Richard Nixon was my graduate school. And I don't think anyone had a better education in national security studies than I did, than sitting down often with the former president and hearing what he has to say, turning it into draft, going up to UCI. In those days, it was a depository library. It might still be, but before the internet, you had to go to a depository library to find anything, and it was all there at UCI, University of California, Irvine. And the drive from California to San Clemente was a little bit up the road, 20 minutes. I'd also drive south because I ran into the fetching Mrs. Hewitt. She has been my wife for 42 years, again this July, and I met her at a Pete Wilson fundraiser. Governor Pete, if you're listening this morning, I say again, thanks to you and Gail, because you were there on the bay, Mission Bay, when I went to fetching Mrs. Hewitt. When I called her up for the second date, first date actually, second time I met her, she didn't remember who I was, but I persuaded her to let me come down. She was living in Fallbrook then, daughter of a Marine Corps colonel, and they had retired to Fallbrook. And Colonel Helmer sat me down. First question was, what do you know about Chesty Puller? And the answer was nothing. I'm a civilian. All right, after Harvard and after Richard Nixon, I went to New York with Nixon, and he moved there in spring of 1980, and I went with him. And I lived there from March until August, and I went in and saw the former president, said, I cannot do this anymore. I do not like New York City. I can't afford it. And he said, fine, go to law school. You need to go to law school anyway. So I went to Michigan Law School, did well, Order of the Coif, if that means to anything to any of you, and got a clerkship on the D.C. Circuit for Roger Robb. And when Judge Robb became ill, I went to clerk for Judge McKinnon when he came back, another senior circuit judge. In between, I was assigned cases by Judge Scalia, who became Justice Scalia, Judge Ginsburg, who became Justice Ginsburg. I was assigned cases by Robert Bork, who was not Justice Bork because of what happened to him by Teddy Kennedy, which began the judicial nightmare that we have now, in confirmation by Skelly Wright, by Spots Robinson. Everybody takes care of clerks whose senior judge is sick. After clerking on the D.C. Circuit, I went to work at the Department of Justice as the National Security Assistant to the Attorney General. That sounds big, but it's not. You just get to review every warrant under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act before it goes to the Attorney General. This is the era before there was a National Security Division. So the Bureau simply brought over their warrants for surveillance of foreign nationals in the United States that had to be surveilled, and the warrant had to be obtained from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. So I learned a lot. Boy, I have never unseen what I saw there. And when anyone comes around to talk about getting rid of the Patriot Act, I tell them, you have no idea who's in this country and what they're up to, and the FBI needs to watch them. So after Bill Smith as the Attorney General and I stayed with Ed Meese, I got an offer from Fred Fielding and Dick Hauser to join the White House counsel's office, and I did. There are only 7 lawyers in the White House counsel's office in Reagan term 2, and that was the greatest little law firm in the world with the most interesting things. I didn't do any of the interesting things. We had some very smart lawyers in the White House at that time, including a guy named Roberts who would go on to be the Chief Justice. I did stuff like protecting the presidential seal. But after that, I went over to the National Endowment for the Humanities and then the Office of Personnel Management as their general counsel. Then I was nominated by President Reagan to become the deputy director of OPM, and I was confirmed. And I hung around to the end, so I became the acting director of OPM. I know all about the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. I know how to move and to remove. It's very hard to remove an employee. And I always argue the first thing that ought to be done when the Republicans get both houses back and a Republican president is redo the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 because it's broken. You can't fire any of the 2 million federal employees, 1.86 million to be exact, not including the military uniform. We don't want authority over the military uniform. That's already set up. It works well. Civilians we need authority over. After President Reagan was done, I was offered a job in the Bush administration, but former President Nixon asked me, and I went back with the Fetching Mrs. Hewitt applauding to California to oversee the construction of Nixon Library and became its first director. Did that for a couple of years. Then I practiced law, and I practiced law from 1989 until I retired from the active practice of law in 2016 in the area of endangered species, natural resources law, Army Corps of Engineers permitting, California Fish and Wildlife System permitting. I did endangered species work in Hawaii and Palau and Nevada, all over, up in Washington State. I was a regulatory lawyer. I appeared in court very infrequently. I know my APA. I know why Loper Bright matters so much, because it reins in the power of the agencies that are indifferent to the people over whom they hold enormous power. During that time, I also got a call from KFI Radio. Would I like to do weekend radio? I said, that beats working. So I did the weekends with Bill Press, with Dr. Laura Schlesinger, with Bill Handel. All of us have gone on to radio careers. I've never been off the radio since 1990, except briefly when I went over to KCET, a television station, the PBS affiliate in LA, in 1992. And for 10 years, I did the nightly news and public affairs programming on KCET with Pat Morrison, Kerman Maddox, and Ruben Martinez. We had the first pre-cable cable show. We were a talking head show, like sort of McLaughlin Group. But I was a conservative, and the others were liberal, and that was fine. I've never, ever been on a conservative show where there are more conservatives than there are liberals until I did the panel with Brett Baer in the last, 4 years. And I have spent my life in media, and I joined Chapman's faculty in 1996, teaching first torts for 1 year while you don't teach con law at Chapman until the second year. I've been teaching constitutional law since then and practicing law. I have had television gigs at MSNBC, NBC, and PBS. I've appeared on every network. I've been writing columns for the Washington Post for almost a decade. I now write for Fox News as well, and I've written 14 books. That's me. Most important thing in my life, Fetching Mrs. Hewitt. Most important thing with Fetching Mrs. Hewitt and I, 3 kids, 6 grandchildren. We are blessed. Never had less than 3 jobs. I believe in working. Don't know what I'll do when I can't work anymore. That's a long way off. But I like to work. I like to teach. I like to talk to you every morning. And I drive you to work. And I hope you watch on the Salem News Channel. I hope that you listen on the Salem Radio Network. I hope you get my podcast, Highly Concentrated Hugh Every Day, which is sort of parts of the radio show, plus a little bit extra. And I hope you join the Universe, where you get every single minute of every single broadcast. Since the first day of this show, Generalissimo Dwayne has been my producer. He has his own podcast, Dwayne's World. From the second week of this show, Adam has been the senior engineer. Harley's been with us for a couple of years. We're cooking. We're cooking now. So you have come to the place where the news happens in the morning, and thus endeth my introduction.